our channel, become our patron. Visit patreon.com/Cycle Maintenance Academy.
Hello there, Mary from Cycle Maintenance Academy. Today we're going to have a look at removing a left-hand crank. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video. Okay, let's begin. Why do you need to remove a crank arm? Damaged pedal threads. If the pedal has been cross-threaded or insufficiently tightened, then it may come off during a ride, most likely stripping the thread. Damaged crank axle interface. If the crank arm wasn't fitted correctly, it may come loose and eventually come off. Tightening it will not solve the problem as the damage has been done. Servicing, replacing bottom bracket. To access the bottom bracket, the crank arms need to be removed first. Removing the arms on a 3-piece crank. The axle is conical, tapering at the crank end. The crank hole is also conical and matches the axle. As the bolt is tightened, the crankset and axle are forced together, making it impossible to remove by hand, and a special tool is needed. Tools required: crank extractor, adjustable spanner, 14mm socket, 8mm Allen key, flat-bladed screwdriver. If you're planning to replace the crank with a different one, first remove the pedal. If you have a dust cap, use the screwdriver to remove it. Position the crank at 5 o'clock. Fit the 14mm socket or 8mm Allen key as close to 7 o'clock as possible. Now, holding the tool and crank with open hands, push them together until you feel the bolt release. This bolt will probably be really tight, so expect to use a lot of force. If you grip the tools, then when the bolt suddenly releases, you may hurt your knuckles. Look at the threaded part of the crank bolt. If it's a slim, solid piece, then use the smaller end of the extractor. If it's wide and hollow, then use the larger end of the extractor. Unscrew the tool so that the extracting end is retracted. Now put a small amount of grease onto the threads of the extractor. Screw the extractor by hand clockwise into the crank arm. If, after repeated attempts, it doesn't go in, don't force it, as you can damage the thread. At this point, seek further help. Once the tool is in, using the adjustable spanner, tighten the outer part. Now, by hand, tighten the inner part of the tool clockwise until it stops. Put the crank arm at 9 o'clock and the spanner at 2 o'clock. While holding the crank in place, screw the extractor clockwise until the crank comes off. Now, while holding the crank, unscrew the outer part of the extractor and remove the tool. Removing a Hollowtech II crank arm. The Hollowtech II crank arm consists of the main body, 2 crank screws with washers that hold the crank arm in place, crank arm fixing bolt that compresses the chain set so that it doesn't wobble but it spins smoothly, stopper plate with a locator that, when the crank is in position correctly, drops into the hole in the axle and stops the crank walking off it, and a crank O-ring that applies pressure to the bottom bracket bearing. The axle and the crank have interlocking splines. There are 2 thicker splines helping to locate the crank into the correct position. Tools required: 5mm Allen key, Hollowtech II crank arm tool, flat-bladed screwdriver. Loosen the crank arm bolts anti-clockwise. Remove the crank arm fixing screw by turning the tool anti-clockwise. Lift the plate on the crank arm bolts. Release the crank arm by gently prising it away with the screwdriver and then pull it off. Removing a self-extracting crank arm. A self-extracting crank arm consists of the main body, a crank retaining ring that is threaded and fitted in the arm and works as an extractor tool, and a crank bolt that pushes against the retaining ring until the arm comes away from the axle. Tools required: pin spanner, 16mm Allen key, 8mm, 10mm Allen key. First, make sure that the retaining ring is tight. Follow the arrows to tighten. Position the crank at 5 o'clock. Fit the 8mm, 10mm Allen key as close to 7 o'clock as possible. Now, holding the tool and crank with open hands, push them together until you feel the bolt release. This bolt will probably be really tight, so expect to use a lot of force. Undo a little bit more until the bolt feels tight again. This is because it is butting up against the retaining ring. Now repeat the process of undoing the bolt until it feels loose. Once loose, keep unscrewing until the crank comes off. Make a note of any spacers or washers on the axle. Thanks for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed that. Why not let us know in the comments below how you got on? Tell us which crank arm you had and tell us how it went.